18 months ago, I made this video, and in this video I demonstrated that if I manipulated the medium, an object could be accelerated without any magical forces. How do I know it wasn't magical? Because I caused it. It's part of scientific method. This video is going to be a challenge to Bob Nodell from Globebusters to support his nonsense, and it's also going to serve as a way of weeding out fake science from actual science, otherwise known as pseudoscience. This is how you work out bullshit from science. You just apply scientific method. Let's have a little listen to what I said back 18 months ago. Just a minute or so. You'll notice that I identify the scientific process where we go through and we itemize all the various components to a scientific test. I could measure the density of a medium, in this case water, and I can make this egg move all by itself with just a little bit of salt. I can observe my phenomena to be that some objects appear to float, some objects appear to sink, some objects will suspend in different mediums. My hypothesis is if I change the medium's density, the egg will move. Newton said if an object moves, a force is present. My null hypothesis is that if I change the density of the medium, the egg will not move. I will activate one of the hypotheses. My independent variable, my presumed cause that I must manipulate in an experiment, is the density of the medium. My dependent variable is the movement of the egg. I'll also try and keep everything else constant. The volumes of water, not will change. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to play a clip from Brandon's chat last night. Somebody sent me this. It was late on for us in England. It was around about midnight. I was in bed. So I missed it all of it. I missed all of it. And what I'm going to do is annotate the key points that he says. Because once we've finished listening to his words, we're going to come back to scientific method and we're going to formulate the scientific method for Bob. Because Bob is a man of science, not a man of pseudoscience, and Bob makes a claim. So we're going to listen to what he says, a few minutes worth, and we're going to put the points on screen. Bear with me while we go through it. Do pay attention and listen to his words carefully.
But my position on this is that there has to be an initial bias. There has to be something there that sets this all off. And I'll put the case forward and all that. But I'm really obviously, there's a much different way to look at it. This not only that, but the math allowing that positive force allows us to calculate how things are going to behave. I mean, there is, in my mind, guys, there's no doubt that there's a bias there, and I will. But Bob, but what you guys are not seeing is this bias there that has to be there in the first place, or the density tower won't work at all.
Okay, so we've got three positive claims. There has to be an initial bias there. It's positive force, and the bias has to be there, otherwise the density tower won't work at all. Obviously, you know what my response to that would be. Well, we can demonstrate relative positions. We can demonstrate that things are relative. The mediums are relative to each other. We would apply the density tower. Quick clip now from a guy called Brian who does exactly that. Shout out to this guy for basically applying the stuff that we can demonstrate and prove, and then stop. Because if it goes beyond that point, then we need some demonstration to prove it. We're going to come back to it in a minute, but for now, let's just consider and appreciate what this guy does to make the point solid.
A little bit further up, you'll see the density tower. In the middle there, you've got dish soap, correct?
Okay, yeah, I see it.
See the dish soap? Now, let's do a thought experiment here. We've got a syringe full of dish soap. If we get this syringe and inject it onto the top layer, which way would it travel?
It's down.
Down to the dish soap layer, yes?
Exactly.
Right, now we're going to put a bit of tube onto the syringe and go right down to the bottom layer and inject it into the bottom layer. Which way is it going to travel? Thank you. I'll rest my case.
Well done, that man. So now we get to the point where we can all agree, because we can demonstrate that things move up as well as down. There isn't a downward bias. But Bob says that the formation of the density tower itself relies on the downward bias that he perceives, rather than the magnitude of the mass that is actually the cause. Bob seems to ignore the magnitude, and he ignores that 3, 4 and 5 aren't going to be lined up in the same order if magnitude is the ordering deciding factor, which we have that with the density tower. You can ascribe relative numbers of any number, arbitrary or what, and you can see that because 5 is bigger than 4, and 7 is bigger than 6, and 9 is bigger than 8, that is where you get your ordering from. It's called magnitude. Bob denies that, or adds to it. Either way, he's making a positive claim. So we can formulate the hypothesis for him and challenge him to support his views with some evidence. Back in the day when I was a baby flat earther, I used to watch a show called Globebusters, and I learnt in that show that there's two pieces of equipment, either a Faraday cage or a zero gauge chamber, that will shield and protect or insulate or isolate objects from electromagnetic interference. If we put a density tower, or if Bob puts a density tower, inside a Faraday cage, it then becomes electromagnetically shielded. That means if there is a bias there, it's then not there anymore, because the bias has been removed. Now, Bob's making the positive claim. He claims there is a positive bias there. So if we assume that there is an electromagnetic effect, and then we isolate it with a Faraday cage or a zero Gauss chamber, then we can isolate that effect, and according to Bob, because the bias has to be there or the density tower won't work at all, the density tower must collapse. Because that's his hypothesis. That's what he claims is the cause of the density tower. So let's formulate that into the scientific method like I did with my egg test.
I can observe my phenomena to be that some objects appear to float, some objects appear to sink, some objects will suspend in different mediums. My hypothesis is if I change the medium's density, the egg will move. Newton said if an object moves, a force is present. My null hypothesis is that if I change the density of the medium, the egg will not move. I will activate one of the hypotheses. My independent variable, my presumed cause that I must manipulate in an experiment, is the density of the medium. My dependent variable is the movement of the egg.
Okay, so as I did in my test, I stated all the stages that are required for a valid scientific experiment. And we're now going to do it for Bob's benefit, because if he does it this way, we can weed out science from pseudoscience, because this is the application of scientific method. This is why the ball earthers don't like this test, because I manipulated the density of the medium and it caused the acceleration that they calculate using this force called gravity. Well, I demonstrated what that force actually was, and it was caused by changing the medium. So, we'll do it for Bob. We're going to start with the first thing, like what's the phenomena? And I'm going to assert that there isn't one. Now, Bob says that there is a downwards bias. Now, I don't observe that. So, if it fails at first instance, then it isn't scientific, because whatever's going on, it goes beyond the physical, the natural world, which is the definition of science. The physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Well, we don't have a naturally occurring phenomena. What we see is what I said. We see the density tower, we see water with things floating on the water, we see things that sink in water, and we see things that are suspended within the water. And we know that basically we can compare water with air, and we can compare it to nature, because it is nature. We see things that are either floating, sinking, or suspended within the medium. Now, Bob says that they're all influenced by a bias. Well, that would be his hypothesis, wouldn't it? So let's just give him that the phenomena does exist. Now, I don't think it does, but if he can demonstrate somewhere in nature where we see a perceived downward bias, that would mean finding an example where aerogel, being more dense than the medium of air, is violated, because once you know that aerogel is more dense than the medium of air, and everything that we're aware of is more dense than aerogel, then it's no longer a naturally occurring phenomena. It's just now explained, because we know what the reason is. It's because it's more dense. But let's just give him, for shits and giggles, that there is a phenomena. The hypothesis that Bob states, according into his own words, his own hypothesis would be that the bias has to be there or the density tower won't work. There has to be an initial bias, doesn't there? They were his words. So his hypothesis is the formation of the density tower is caused by the downward bias, because that's what he said. The bias has to be there or the density tower won't work. So his hypothesis has to be the density tower is arranged because of the downward bias. The alternative hypothesis would be that the density tower is not arranged because of the downward bias. The independent variable would be manipulating the electromagnetic field that Bob believes is causing the thing, the order, by applying a Faraday cage or a zero Gauss chamber, and then if what he says is true, the density tower would collapse. Because that's what he says is the cause. He literally says, without the bias, the density tower won't work at all. So all he has to do is get a density tower just of 3 liquids, say milk, dishwashing soap, and some other one, vegetable oil. Let them find their level, and then put a Faraday cage around them, and then they should magically collapse. So there's his hypothesis. His alternative hypothesis would be that it didn't collapse. His independent variable is the application of the Faraday cage to block out electromagnetic effect. And then we're left with the dependent variable would be the collapsing of the tower or not. So we've got a scientific method there, haven't we, Bob? So let's see you put your money where your mouth is here, as it were, and demonstrate it like I did. I thought the medium caused it, and I manipulated the density of the medium, and an acceleration was caused, and we all understand it because it's demonstrable. It's repeatable, it doesn't require a load of money to do it, or expensive equipment where NASA then gets involved and we can't validate it or whatever. You can do this in the kitchen. Now, Bob makes the claim that in the Vomit Comet collapses the density tower. And why is that? Well, the problem is, Bob doesn't really need to do the density tower hypothesis test, does he? Because the plane acts as a Faraday cage. So if Bob was correct, then the density tower would never even exist in a plane or in anything. It would be electromagnetically shielded in a variety of scenarios. A car, a tanker, a plane, you name it, you could just put anything becomes a Faraday cage. And that electromagnetically shields out the thing that he claims is the cause. You know that without even doing the test. So, given that we've got the null hypothesis, that the Faraday cage does not cause the collapse of the tower, then that concludes and proves within scientific method that the thing that does not cause the collapse of the tower is the Faraday cage. That means there is no downwards bias, Bob. I don't know what you're doing, Bob, but you said that you weren't going to allow certain people in. I gave you the benefit of the doubt on the show. I thought you were talking about the likes of the Rumpus, and we can all understand for why.
I said recently that there would be people that would be excluded from this. And did I mean the people from Nathan Oakley, like Riley and people like that? Yes, I did. Why? Because you cannot fucking express an opinion without being called a shill. You can't think differently without being called a shill or somebody spreading rumors about you.
But then you elaborated and said that you'd not let me in. Yeah, I'm the one that's been asking for this for years from you. Well, this is the reason why you can't talk to me in private. Because it has to be done publicly. You're the one pushing this nonsense. You're going to have to demonstrate that it's true. But we've already got the science that demonstrates that it's not. Because Faraday cages essentially become the plane, and the density tower doesn't collapse in the plane, does it? So that debunks your claim, Bob. You need to retract your nonsense, Because what you're doing, Bob, indirectly or intentionally, you are confusing people new to the topic, like for instance Rachie with the 5 zeros. She's on her own little journey and she's going to work it out in the end. But when people like you come along and try and confuse the matter by inferring, insisting, demanding that there's some external force that's a bias that's downwards only, Bob, I can just as easily say that there's an upwards bias caused by a magical layer of the firmament that's pulling all these things up. And it doesn't pull the heavy stuff, it only pulls the light stuff, and that's where the bias comes from. Of course I'm talking not codswallop, I'm doing it to demonstrate the point. Bob, stop confusing the matter. Stop pushing this as though it's like the gospel. It isn't the gospel, it doesn't exist, and you haven't got any evidence to support it. Nobody minds you having your opinion, Bob, but everybody minds that you're ramming it down everyone's throat because you're actually causing division, you're causing people to put up walls, and you're confusing the matter. That is shill-like behaviour, Bob. Whether you accept it or not is up to you, but it is exactly what the controlled agents do. They cause division, they disrupt communications, and they obfuscate points, and that is what you're doing, Bob. You are a shill. Unless you can demonstrate that the electromagnetic field that you believe is causing the bias collapses the density tower, because that's what you said it was reliant on.
What I'm now going to try and prove is that if I change the density of the medium, I will cause the effect by adding salt. So if I can change it, because I'm the experimenter and I'm manipulating my presumed cause, my independent variable is the medium, that egg moves, I've caused it. We know the parts per million is about 300. All we need to do is pour some of this in. Hey, what do you know? The eggs immediately moved. Didn't have to wait for that, did we?